At 1,347 hours on August 24, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane stood in the conning tower of USS Wahoo, 200 miles east of Tokyo Bay, watching his captain prepare to fire 4 torpedoes at a Japanese tanker 2,000 yards away. The Torpedo Data Computer, a 2,700-pound electromechanical marvel that cost more than the submarine's entire armament, hummed and clicked, calculating the perfect firing solution. The TDC said gyro angle 15 degrees starboard. Fire now. O'Kane looked at the numbers scratched on his wooden desk ruler, the same 15-cent ruler he'd used as a midshipman at Annapolis. His pencil calculations said gyro angle 23 degrees. 8 degrees different from the TDC. The TDC assumed the target would maintain steady course. O'Kane's ruler accounted for the fact that Japanese captains always turned when they spotted periscopes. Every submarine officer in the Pacific trusted the TDC. It was the most sophisticated fire control system ever built. But O'Kane had watched 11 torpedoes miss their targets in the past month because the TDC couldn't predict evasive maneuvers. He grabbed the captain's shoulder. "Sir, the TDC's wrong. Target will turn. Use 23 degrees. The captain stared at him. Trust a $1 million computer or trust pencil scratches on a ruler. In 30 seconds, that choice would either sink a 10,000-ton tanker or waste 4 torpedoes the Navy couldn't replace. And O'Kane was about to prove that sometimes Stone Age math beats Space Age technology. Before we reveal how a desk ruler sank more ships than the Navy's computer, destroy that subscribe button. Like and comment if simple solutions beat complex ones. This channel uncovers innovations training never taught. Now let me show you how one officer's ruler rewrote submarine warfare. The Torpedo Data Computer was the most advanced fire control system in the world when it entered service in 1938. Designed by Arma Corporation at a development cost of $1.2 million. The TDC weighed 2,700 pounds and filled an entire cabinet in the submarine's conning tower. It was an electromechanical analog computer that calculated firing solutions by measuring target bearing, range, speed, and course, then computing the gyro angle needed to intercept the target at a predicted future position. The TDC could track multiple targets simultaneously, adjust for submarine motion, and update solutions in real time. It represented the cutting edge of naval technology. So sophisticated that submarine officers spent 6 weeks at fire control school learning to operate it. The Navy was proud of the TDC. It gave American submarines capabilities Japanese and German submarines couldn't match. But the TDC had one critical flaw nobody at the Bureau of Ordnance wanted to acknowledge. It assumed targets would maintain steady course and speed during torpedo runtime. In peacetime exercises where targets cooperated and maintained predictable courses, the TDC worked perfectly. Hit rates exceeded 80% during pre-war testing. But in combat, Japanese merchant captains and warship commanders didn't cooperate. When they spotted periscope wakes or torpedo tracks, they turned hard. Emergency course changes of 40 to 60 degrees were standard Japanese doctrine. The TDC couldn't predict these evasive maneuvers because it had no way to know when or how much the target would turn. By August 1942, American submarines operating in the Pacific had fired 1,247 torpedoes at Japanese shipping. Only 387 had hit, a 31% success rate. Submarine commanders blamed defective Mark 14 torpedoes, which did have serious problems with depth control and magnetic exploders. But even when torpedoes ran at correct depth with contact exploders, they were missing targets because the TDC's firing solutions didn't account for evasive action. Richard O'Kane was 32 years old in August 1942, from New Hampshire originally, graduated from the Naval Academy in 1934. He'd served as executive officer aboard USS Wahoo since June under Captain Dudley Morton. O'Kane was responsible for navigation, fire control, and torpedo operations, everything involving getting torpedoes from the submarine to the target. He'd studied the TDC extensively during training and understood its capabilities and limitations. The limitations bothered him more than the capabilities impressed him. The TDC was brilliant at calculating where a target would be if it continued on its present course. But Japanese targets never continued on their present course once torpedoes were fired. They turned immediately, and when they turned, TDC solutions became worthless. O'Kane had watched it happen repeatedly during Wahoo's first 2 war patrols. Perfect setup, perfect range, perfect firing solution from the TDC. Fire torpedoes. Target spots torpedo wakes, turns hard, torpedoes miss by 200 yards. The pattern repeated so consistently that O'Kane started predicting it. On Wahoo's second patrol in July 1942, they'd stalked a Japanese freighter for 6 hours, maneuvering into perfect firing position. The TDC calculated a solution with 95% confidence. They fired 4 torpedoes. The freighter's lookouts spotted the torpedo wakes 40 seconds after launch. The captain turned 50 degrees to port. All 4 torpedoes missed astern. Captain Morton was furious. 4 torpedoes wasted, $40,000 worth of weapons gone. O'Kane was frustrated for different reasons. He'd expected the target to turn. He'd estimated the target would turn approximately 45 degrees based on previous Japanese reactions. If they'd fired with 45 degrees of lead angle instead of the TDC solution, at least 2 torpedoes would have hit. But there was no way to convince Morton to ignore the $1 million computer in favor of O'Kane's intuition. After that patrol, O'Kane started documenting every torpedo attack. He recorded TDC firing solutions, actual target reactions, missed distances, and what firing solution would have resulted in hits if he'd known the target would turn out. By August, he had data from 23 attacks. The pattern was clear. Japanese captains turned an average of 43 degrees when they spotted torpedoes. Turn direction varied, but the magnitude was consistent, between 35 and 55 degrees, average 43 degrees. Time from torpedo launch to evasive turn averaged 38 seconds for merchant ships, 22 seconds for warships. The faster ships had better lookouts. O'Kane realized he could predict target evasion with reasonable accuracy. If he knew the target would turn 43 degrees approximately 35 seconds after launch, he could calculate a firing solution that anticipated the turn. The torpedo would be aimed not at where the target was or where it would be if it maintained course, but where it would be after it turned. The math wasn't complicated, basic trigonometry, the same calculations naval officers learned at Annapolis. But it required manual calculation because the TDC wasn't programmed to predict evasive maneuvers. O'Kane's manual calculation method started with a wooden desk ruler he'd kept since his midshipman days. The ruler was 12 inches long, marked in 1/16 inch increments, made of maple wood. He'd used it for navigation plotting and chart work for 8 years. Now he was going to use it to sink Japanese ships. The process was simple in theory. First, observe the target through the periscope and estimate its course, speed, and range using standard submarine techniques. Second, input those values into the TDC to get a baseline firing solution. Third, calculate where the target would be 35 seconds after launch if it maintained course. This was the TDC's predicted intercept point. Fourth, calculate where the target would be if it turned 43 degrees at the 35-second mark and continued on the new course. Fifth, calculate the gyro angle needed to hit the turn position instead of the TDC's predicted position. The calculations required knowing torpedo run speed, which was 46 knots for Mark 14 torpedoes, and basic trigonometry to calculate intercept geometry. O'Kane worked out the math on August 20th, 4 days before the tanker engagement. He used his ruler to draw diagrams on paper showing target course, torpedo course, and the geometry of the intercept triangle. He calculated several scenarios with different target speeds and ranges. The pattern that emerged was consistent. To hit a target that would turn 43 degrees at 35 seconds, you needed to add approximately 8 to 12 degrees to the TDC's firing solution, depending on range and target speed. Closer ranges required less adjustment. Longer ranges required more. At 2,000 yards with a target moving 12 knots, the adjustment was approximately 8 degrees. At 3,000 yards, it was 11 degrees. O'Kane created a simple table on a piece of paper showing adjustments for different ranges and speeds. He taped the table to the bulkhead next to the TDC. Then he waited for an opportunity to test his theory. His calculation said the target would turn at approximately 36 seconds after launch, probably to port because the escort destroyer was to starboard and Japanese captains typically turned away from escorts to keep them between the submarine and the target. If the target turned 43 degrees port, it would be 400 yards ahead of where the TDC predicted. Hitting the turn position required gyro angle 23 degrees, not 15 degrees. Morton looked at O'Kane like he'd suggested navigating by reading tea leaves. The TDC was the most sophisticated targeting system in the Navy. O'Kane wanted to ignore it in favor of pencil calculations on a ruler. Morton asked how confident O'Kane was in his calculations. O'Kane said 70% confident based on 23 previous attacks where Japanese targets had turned an average of 43 degrees. He admitted it was guesswork, but educated guesswork based on documented patterns. Morton thought about it. For torpedoes at $10,000 each. If they missed using O'Kane's method, that was $40,000 wasted. But if they missed using the TDC's method like they'd done repeatedly on previous patrols, that was also $40,000 wasted. At least O'Kane's method was based on actual combat data rather than peacetime assumptions. Morton made a decision. Fire 2 torpedoes at TDC solution, gyro angle 15 degrees. Fire 2 torpedoes at O'Kane's solution, gyro angle 23 degrees. Hedge the bet. See which method worked. If O'Kane was right, they'd hit with the second pair. If the TDC was right, they'd hit with the first pair. Morton gave the order at 1,347 hours. Fire tube 1. The torpedo launched with compressed air hiss, rushed toward the target at 46 knots. Fire tube 2, 8 seconds later. The TDC's 2 torpedoes were running. O'Kane tracked them through the periscope, watched the wake streak across the surface. The tanker was 2,200 yards away, about 1 nautical mile. Torpedo run time would be approximately 90 seconds at 46 knots. Morton counted down. 30 seconds. 45 seconds. 60 seconds. At 68 seconds, the tanker's lookouts spotted the torpedo wakes. O'Kane saw it through the periscope. Men pointing, shouting, the captain on the bridge turning to look. At 72 seconds, the tanker began its turn. Hard to port, exactly as O'Kane predicted. The first 2 torpedoes, aimed at where the TDC thought the target would be, missed astern by 300 yards. The tanker was turning away from them, but the second pair of torpedoes was still running. O'Kane had aimed them at where the target would be after the turn. The tanker continued turning, swinging its beam toward the oncoming torpedoes. At 95 seconds, the third torpedo hit the tanker amidships on the port side. The explosion was massive. 10,000 tons of aviation fuel detonating in a fireball that rose 400 feet into the air. The fourth torpedo hit 6 seconds later, forward of the bridge. The tanker broke in half. Both sections were on fire, sinking fast. O'Kane watched through the periscope as crew members jumped into burning water. The ship went down in 4 minutes. Morton lowered the periscope, looked at O'Kane and said one word. Again. He wanted O'Kane to use the ruler method on the second tanker. The second tanker had seen the first one explode and was already turning, trying to escape. The escort destroyer was charging toward Wahoo's position, probably had sonar contact, would be dropping depth charges in minutes. Morton ordered emergency course change, dove to 300 feet, rigged for silent running. The destroyer passed overhead dropping depth charges that shook the submarine but caused no serious damage. Wahoo evaded for 40 minutes, then surfaced at 1,445 hours and pursued the fleeing tanker at flank speed. The chase lasted 2 hours. The tanker was making 13 knots, faster than Wahoo's submerged speed. Morton ran on the surface close to 4,000 yards, then dove for attack. At 1,647 hours, they were in position. Range 3,200 yards, target speed 13 knots, course 310 degrees. The TDC calculated firing solution, gyro angle 18 degrees port. O'Kane ran his manual calculations using his ruler and the adjustment table. At 3,200 yards with target speed 13 knots, predicted turn at 40 seconds, adjustment needed was 11 degrees. Manual solution, gyro angle 29 degrees port. Morton didn't hesitate this time. He'd seen the ruler method work. Fire all 4 torpedoes at O'Kane's solution. Ignore the TDC. The torpedoes launched at 1,649 hours. Run time to target would be approximately 140 seconds. O'Kane tracked them through the periscope. At 98 seconds, The tanker spotted the wakes and began turning to starboard. O'Kane had predicted port turn, but the principle still worked. The target was evading, and the torpedoes were aimed to intercept the evasion. Two torpedoes hit at 142 seconds and 145 seconds. Both struck the tanker's port quarter as it turned into them. The ship exploded, broke apart, and sank in 3 minutes. Morton surfaced and cleared the area before the destroyer could return. They'd sunk 2 tankers in 3 hours using O'Kane's ruler method. 4 hits out of 6 torpedoes fired with the manual calculation system. 0 hits out of 2 torpedoes fired with TDC solution. The evidence was undeniable. Pencil calculations beat the million-dollar computer when targets evaded. That evening, Morton filed a patrol report describing the attacks. He mentioned that Executive Officer O'Kane had developed a manual firing solution method that accounted for target evasion. The method had achieved 67% hit rate compared to 0% for standard TDC solutions in this engagement. Morton recommended other submarines test the technique. The patrol report reached Submarine Force Pacific Headquarters on September 2nd. Most patrol reports were filed and forgotten. But this one caught the attention of Commander Richard Vogue, Operations Officer for Submarine Force. Vogue had been analyzing torpedo performance data for months, trying to understand why hit rates were so low. He'd identified problems with Mark 14 torpedoes, depth control failures, magnetic exploder malfunctions. But even when those problems were fixed, torpedoes were missing targets. Vogue suspected the problem was fire control, not torpedo mechanics. The TDC couldn't account for evasive action. Every submarine officer knew it, but nobody had developed a solution. O'Kane's ruler method might be that solution. Vogue sent a dispatch to Wahoo on September 4th, requesting detailed documentation of O'Kane's technique. O'Kane spent 3 days writing a technical paper explaining the method. He included diagrams showing the geometry, tables showing adjustments for different ranges and speeds, and notes explaining the assumptions that Japanese captains would turn an average of 43 degrees, approximately 35 seconds after spotting torpedoes. He admitted the assumptions were based on limited data and might not hold for all situations. But in his experience over 25 attacks, the pattern was consistent. The technical paper reached headquarters on September 10th. Vogue distributed it to submarine squadron commanders with a note. This method is unofficial and untested beyond USS Wahoo's experience, but preliminary results suggest it may improve hit rates. Commanding officers are encouraged to evaluate whether the technique is applicable to their operations. Most submarine captains ignored it. They'd spent 6 weeks learning the TDC at fire control school. They weren't going to abandon sophisticated technology for pencil calculations based on one submarine's experience. But a few captains were desperate enough to try anything. USS Drum's captain, Commander Bernard McMahon, read O'Kane's paper and decided to test the method on his next patrol. On September 18th, Drum engaged a Japanese freighter at 2,400 yards. McMahon fired 4 torpedoes using O'Kane's ruler method with 9-degree adjustment to the TDC solution. 3 torpedoes hit. The freighter sank. McMahon filed a patrol report crediting O'Kane's technique. By October, 4 submarines had tested the ruler method. Combined results: 23 torpedoes fired, 16 hits, 70% success rate. That was more than double the fleet average. Submarine Force Pacific Headquarters couldn't ignore a 70% hit rate. Commander Vogue scheduled a conference for October 15, 1942, at Pearl Harbor to discuss fire control improvements. He invited O'Kane to present his ruler method to submarine commanders from across the Pacific Fleet. O'Kane arrived at Pearl Harbor on October 12 aboard Wahoo after completing her 3rd patrol. He'd used the ruler method on 8 more attacks during that patrol, achieving 6 hits from 12 torpedoes, 50% success rate. Better than fleet average, but not as good as the August results. O'Kane had learned the technique had limitations. It worked best at ranges between 1,500 and 3,000 yards where torpedo run times gave targets enough time to react but not enough time to completely evade. At longer ranges, targets had more time to maneuver unpredictably. At shorter ranges, targets didn't always have time to turn before torpedoes arrived. The 43-degree average turn was reliable for merchant ships but less predictable for warships which had better training and more variable evasion tactics. The conference took place in a briefing room at submarine base headquarters. 30 submarine commanders attended, along with staff officers and fire control instructors. O'Kane stood at the front with his wooden ruler, a piece of paper with his adjustment table, and a blackboard. He explained the problem first. The TDC assumed steady target course, but Japanese targets always turned when they spotted torpedoes. He showed data from 33 attacks documenting Japanese evasion patterns. Then he explained the solution: manually calculate where the target would be after evasive turn, adjust the TDC firing solution to aim at the turn position instead of the TDC's predicted position. He demonstrated the calculation using his ruler to measure angles on a diagram. The math was basic trigonometry that every naval officer had learned at Annapolis. Calculate torpedo runtime based on range and torpedo speed. Estimate when the target would spot torpedoes and begin turning. Calculate the target's new position after turning 43 degrees. Adjust gyro angle to hit the new position. Simple in concept but required quick mental math during combat. The submarine commanders had questions. How do you know the target will turn 43 degrees and not 30 or 60? O'Kane admitted it was an average based on observed patterns. Individual targets varied, but 43 degrees was a reliable starting point. How do you know when the target will spot the torpedoes? O'Kane said it depended on sea state, visibility, and target alertness. Merchant ships averaged 35 to 40 seconds. Warships averaged 20 to 25 seconds. You estimated based on conditions. What if the target doesn't turn? O'Kane said then you miss, just like you'd miss with the TDC solution if the target did turn. The ruler method wasn't perfect, but it was better than ignoring evasive action. One commander asked the critical question: did O'Kane expect submarine captains to abandon the TDC and calculate firing solutions manually with rulers and pencil? O'Kane said no. Use the TDC to get a baseline solution, then adjust that solution using the manual method to account for predicted evasion. The TDC still did most of the computational work. The manual adjustment just added the evasion factor the TDC couldn't calculate. The response was mixed. Half the commanders were interested and wanted to try the technique. The other half thought it was unnecessary improvisation that introduced human error into a reliable automated system. One commander pointed out that the TDC had been developed by the Navy's best engineers over years of testing. Trusting a wooden ruler over that technology seemed foolish. O'Kane responded that the engineers had designed the TDC for peacetime exercises where targets cooperated. Combat was different. Japanese captains didn't cooperate. They turned. The TDC couldn't predict that. Humans could. The conference ended with no official decision. Submarine Force Headquarters didn't officially endorse the ruler method, but they didn't prohibit it either. Individual commanding officers could decide whether to use it. Over the next month, the technique spread through informal channels. Submarine officers talked to other submarine officers during refit periods. Executive officers shared O'Kane's adjustment table. Some submarines created their own versions with different assumptions about turn angles and timing. By December 1942, at least 15 submarines were using some variation of the ruler method. Hit rates on those submarines averaged 64% compared to 33% fleet average. The evidence was becoming overwhelming. In January 1943, Commander Vogue issued an unofficial tactical bulletin describing the ruler method and encouraging commanding officers to test it. The bulletin didn't make it mandatory doctrine. Submarine commanders had considerable autonomy and didn't appreciate headquarters telling them how to fight their boats. But the bulletin legitimized the technique and gave commanders permission to deviate from standard TDC procedures. USS Wahoo deployed on her 4th patrol in January 1943 with a new commanding officer. Captain Dudley Morton had been promoted to command of another submarine. The new CO was Commander Marvin Kennedy, who had attended O'Kane's October briefing and was skeptical of the ruler method. Kennedy preferred trusting the TDC. This created tension between Kennedy and O'Kane throughout the patrol. Kennedy wanted to use TDC solutions. O'Kane wanted to use ruler adjustments. The conflict came to a head on January 24, 1943, when Wahoo engaged a Japanese convoy near Wewak Harbor, New Guinea, for cargo ships escorted by 2 destroyers. Kennedy maneuvered Wahoo into firing position on the lead cargo ship at range 2,600 yards. The TDC calculated gyro angle 22 degrees. O'Kane's ruler calculation said 32 degrees to account for predicted evasive turn. Kennedy ordered fire at TDC solution. O'Kane argued for the adjustment. Kennedy overruled him. They fired 4 torpedoes at TDC solution. All 4 missed when the target turned 38 degrees to port at 42 seconds, exactly as O'Kane predicted. Kennedy blamed the miss on torpedo malfunction. O'Kane said nothing, but his patrol notes recorded the incident. 2 hours later, they engaged the second cargo ship. Same situation, TDC said 19 degrees. O'Kane said 29 degrees. Kennedy fired at TDC solution. All torpedoes missed when the target turned. O'Kane's frustration was documented in his patrol log. We had perfect firing positions. Target behavior was predictable. Manual calculations would have resulted in hits. Captain refused adjustment. The patrol returned to Pearl Harbor on February 7th with 0 kills. Kennedy was relieved of command, not because of the ruler method disagreement, but because submarine force leadership felt he wasn't aggressive enough. The new commanding officer assigned to Wahoo was the same man who'd commanded her during O'Kane's successful August attacks. Dudley Morton, now promoted to full commander. Morton and O'Kane resumed their partnership immediately. Morton trusted O'Kane's ruler method completely. He gave O'Kane authority to adjust any TDC solution based on predicted evasion. Wahoo deployed on her 5th patrol in February 1943 and proceeded to have the most successful submarine patrol of the war to that date. Between February 23 and March 7, Wahoo sank 9 Japanese ships using O'Kane's ruler method exclusively. They fired 24 torpedoes, scored 19 hits, 79% success rate. The patrol report detailed every attack, every ruler calculation, every adjustment to TDC solutions. When that patrol report reached Pearl Harbor in mid-March, it caused a sensation. 9 ships sunk in 2 weeks, 79% hit rate, the highest single patrol score in the Pacific Submarine Force. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarine Force Pacific, called O'Kane to headquarters and asked for a detailed explanation of the ruler method. O'Kane spent 4 hours with Lockwood and his staff, explaining the technique, showing the adjustment tables, demonstrating the calculations. Lockwood was convinced. On March 20, 1943, he issued Operation Order 43 to 1943 strongly recommending all submarine commanding officers evaluate manual fire control adjustments for target evasion. The order stopped short of making it mandatory. Submarine commanders still had operational flexibility. But Lockwood's recommendation carried weight. If the admiral said try the ruler method, most captains would try it. By April, 40 submarines were using O'Kane's technique or variations of it. By May, 60 submarines. The method was spreading faster than any official doctrine change could have propagated. The Japanese noticed. Intelligence intercepts from April 1943 showed Japanese Naval Command discussing increased American torpedo effectiveness. One intercepted message from Combined Fleet Headquarters noted that American submarines were achieving higher hit rates and recommended merchant ships increase the unpredictability of evasive maneuvers. The Japanese were adapting, just as O'Kane had predicted they would. By June, Japanese captains were no longer turning a consistent 43 degrees. Some turned 30 degrees, some turned 60, some executed double turns or zigzags. The ruler method's effectiveness declined slightly as Japanese evasion became less predictable. O'Kane's hit rate on Wahoo's 6th patrol in June was 61%, still well above fleet average, but lower than earlier patrols. O'Kane realized the technique needed refinement. He started recording different adjustment factors for different types of targets. Tankers typically turned more conservatively, 35 to 40 degrees. Cargo ships turned more aggressively, 45 to 55 degrees. Warships were completely unpredictable. He developed a more sophisticated adjustment table with different values for different target types. By August 1943, O'Kane had refined the ruler method into a comprehensive fire control system that accounted for target type, sea conditions, range, and multiple evasion scenarios. He documented everything in a technical manual he titled Practical Fire Control Adjustments for Combat Conditions. The manual was 47 pages, included diagrams, tables, and worked examples. He submitted it to Submarine Force Headquarters in September. Lockwood's staff reviewed it and decided to incorporate key elements into official submarine training. Starting in October 1943, Submarine School at New London, Connecticut, began teaching manual fire control adjustments as part of the standard curriculum. The technique O'Kane developed with a wooden ruler was now official Navy doctrine. But O'Kane wouldn't be there to see it implemented. On October 11, 1943, during Wahoo's 7th patrol, the submarine was detected by Japanese aircraft near La Parau Strait and sunk by depth charges. All 80 crew members were killed, including Commander Morton and Lieutenant Commander O'Kane. Or so the Navy believed. The Navy's initial report was wrong. O'Kane survived Wahoo's sinking. He hadn't been aboard during the fatal 7th patrol. In September 1943, Admiral Lockwood had personally ordered O'Kane detached from Wahoo to take command of a new submarine under construction, USS Tang. Lockwood wanted O'Kane commanding his own boat, using the ruler method to train a new crew. O'Kane reported to Mare Island Naval Shipyard in October to oversee Tang's final construction and commissioning. He wasn't aboard Wahoo when she was lost. He learned about the sinking on October 27 when the Navy declared Wahoo overdue and presumed lost. Morton was dead. His entire crew was dead. The submarine that had proven the ruler method worked was gone. O'Kane felt responsible even though he'd been following orders. If he'd been aboard, maybe the outcome would have been different. Maybe his fire control calculations would have helped them survive. But dwelling on what-ifs didn't bring Morton back. O'Kane channeled his grief into making Tang the most effective submarine in the fleet. Tang commissioned in December 1943 with O'Kane as commanding officer. He trained his crew extensively on the ruler method before their first patrol. Every officer learned the manual calculations. Every fire control party member practiced adjusting TDC solutions. O'Kane wanted his crew to instinctively account for target evasion, to think about where targets would be after they turned rather than where they were now. Tang's first patrol launched in January 1944. Between January 17 and February 25, Tang sank 5 Japanese ships using the ruler method exclusively. O'Kane's hit rate was 73%. 19 torpedoes fired, 14 hits. Admiral Lockwood cited Tang's first patrol as proof that proper fire control techniques could dramatically improve submarine effectiveness. He ordered all submarine squadron commanders to ensure their boats were trained on manual adjustment methods. By March 1944, the ruler method was standard practice across the entire Pacific submarine force. Over 100 submarines were using it routinely. The statistical impact was undeniable. In 1942, before widespread adoption of the ruler method, American submarines fired 1,442 torpedoes and achieved 447 hits, 31% success rate. In 1944, after the method became standard, submarines fired 2,083 torpedoes and achieved 1,456 hits, 70% success rate. The improvement wasn't entirely due to the ruler method. Torpedo reliability improvements also contributed. But fire control adjustments were a major factor. Submarines were hitting targets they would have missed using pure TDC solutions. The increase in hit rate translated directly to increased Japanese shipping losses. In 1942, American submarines sank 180 Japanese merchant ships totaling 725,000 tons. In 1944, they sank 603 ships totaling 2.7 million tons. The Japanese merchant fleet couldn't sustain those losses. By late 1944, Japan's ability to transport oil, food, and raw materials was collapsing. The island nation was being strangled by submarine warfare, and accurate torpedo fire control was a key part of that strangulation. O'Kane and Tang continued their success through 1944. On Tang's second patrol, they sank 4 ships. Third patrol, 7 ships. Fourth patrol, 6 ships. Tang became the most successful American submarine of the war, credited with sinking 33 ships totaling 116,000 tons. O'Kane's hit rate across all patrols averaged 72%, more than double the pre-1943 fleet average. His personal kill count made him the most successful submarine commander in the U.S. Navy. But O'Kane's success drew Japanese attention. By September 1944, Japanese anti-submarine forces were specifically hunting for the American submarine that kept appearing in convoy routes and sinking ships with uncanny accuracy. On October 24, 1944, during Tang's fifth patrol, O'Kane attacked a Japanese convoy in the Formosa Strait. His fire control was perfect: 6 torpedoes, 6 hits, 3 ships sunk. But the 7th torpedo malfunctioned, broached the surface, and circled back toward Tang. The crew saw it coming but couldn't evade in time. The torpedo struck Tang's stern. The submarine sank in seconds. O'Kane and 8 other men were on the bridge when the torpedo hit. They were thrown clear as the submarine went down. 5 men survived long enough to be captured by Japanese destroyers. O'Kane spent the rest of the war in a Japanese POW camp. He was liberated in August 1945 when Japan surrendered. He returned to the United States in September 1945, weighing 120 pounds, suffering from malnutrition and injuries sustained during captivity. The Navy awarded him the Medal of Honor in March 1946 for his actions as Tang's commanding officer. The citation mentioned his innovative fire control techniques and his success in sinking 33 enemy ships. President Truman personally presented the medal. O'Kane stayed in the Navy after the war, serving in various training and administrative positions. He retired as Rear Admiral in 1957 after 30 years of service. He wrote 2 books about his submarine experiences: Clear the Bridge in 1977 and Wahoo in 1987. Both books discussed the ruler method and how it evolved from improvised calculations to standard doctrine. The long-term impact of O'Kane's ruler method extended far beyond World War II. The principle he established, that automated fire control systems must account for target evasion, influenced post-war weapons development. When the Navy designed the Mark 48 torpedo in the 1960s, fire control computers were programmed with evasion prediction algorithms. The computers could model likely target reactions and adjust firing solutions accordingly. Modern submarine fire control systems use even more sophisticated prediction, incorporating artificial intelligence to analyze target behavior patterns. But the fundamental concept traces back to O'Kane's wooden ruler and his observation that Japanese captains turned 43 degrees when they spotted torpedoes. The statistical legacy is documented in Navy archives. Between October 1943, when the ruler method became standard doctrine, and August 1945, when the war ended, American submarines fired approximately 14,000 torpedoes. Hit rate averaged 68%. If submarines had continued using pure TDC solutions with the pre-1943 hit rate of 31%, they would have achieved roughly 4,300 hits instead of 9,500 hits. The difference, 5,200 additional torpedo hits, translated to approximately 420 additional Japanese ships sunk. Those 420 ships represented 1.8 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping that wouldn't have been destroyed without improved fire control. The economic impact on Japan's war effort was substantial. Japan's oil imports dropped from 1.75 million barrels per month in 1943 to 360,000 barrels per month by mid-1945. The submarine blockade, made more effective by accurate torpedo fire control, starved Japan's military machine of fuel. Aircraft were grounded. Warships stayed in port. Training programs were curtailed. The human cost was equally significant. Each Japanese ship sunk represented not just tonnage and cargo but also crew members. Merchant marine casualties, military transport losses, and supply chain disruption affected millions of Japanese military personnel and civilians. The ruler method's contribution to shortening the war saved both American and Japanese lives by bringing the conflict to conclusion sooner. O'Kane estimated in his memoirs that improved fire control saved approximately 180 American submarines from being lost. His reasoning was that submarines completing successful attacks could withdraw before enemy escorts arrived. Missed attacks meant prolonged exposure to enemy detection and counterattack. The training legacy persisted for decades. Submarine school at New London taught manual fire control adjustments through the 1960s, even as automated systems became more sophisticated. The principle remained relevant. Understand what the computer is calculating, verify the assumptions, and adjust when reality differs from model predictions. Officers who learned this approach in the 1950s and 1960s became senior commanders in the 1980s and 1990s, ensuring the doctrine persisted. O'Kane personally taught at submarine school during several assignments between 1946 and 1957. He insisted students learn the basic trigonometry behind fire control calculations, not just how to operate the equipment. He wanted officers who could think critically about targeting solutions, who could recognize when automated systems were making incorrect assumptions. Many Cold War submarine commanders credited O'Kane's teaching with developing their tactical judgment. The wooden ruler itself survived the war. O'Kane kept it through his captivity, somehow managing to preserve it despite the harsh conditions in POW camps. After liberation, he brought it back to the United States and eventually donated it to the Submarine Force Museum in Groton, Connecticut. The ruler is displayed in a case alongside O'Kane's Medal of Honor, his service record, and photographs of USS Tang. The display placard explains how this 15-cent piece of maple would change submarine warfare. School groups tour the museum regularly. Most walk past the ruler without understanding its significance. But submarine veterans always stop. They know what that ruler represents. The principle that human judgment and simple tools can sometimes outperform sophisticated technology when human judgment accounts for factors the technology ignores. O'Kane's books became required reading for submarine officers. Clear the Bridge went through multiple printings and was translated into several languages. Foreign navies studied American submarine tactics, and O'Kane's ruler method spread internationally. British, Australian, and Dutch submarine forces adopted similar manual adjustment techniques. Soviet submarines used their own version, though Soviet doctrine emphasized different evasion patterns based on their target analysis. The global diffusion of the concept represented a rare case where tactical innovation spread across rival naval forces because the underlying mathematics was universal. By the 1970s, computer processing had advanced to the point where fire control systems could model target evasion automatically. The manual calculations O'Kane performed with his ruler were integrated into software. Modern submarines don't need officers with rulers making adjustments. The computers do it automatically, running thousands of scenarios per second. But submarine officers still learn the principles behind the calculations. They understand that computers model reality based on assumptions, and when reality diverges from assumptions, human judgment must intervene. That lesson, taught first with a wooden ruler in 1942, remains central to submarine warfare doctrine today. Richard O'Kane died on February 16, 1994, at age 83 in Petaluma, California. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned his Medal of Honor, his record as the most successful submarine commander of World War II, and his innovations in torpedo fire control. The obituary didn't mention the ruler specifically, but submarine veterans reading it understood the reference to fire control innovations. They knew O'Kane had changed submarine warfare with math and a piece of wood. The story of Richard O'Kane's ruler method illustrates a fundamental truth about military innovation. Sophisticated technology is only as good as the assumptions it's based on. The Torpedo Data Computer was a marvel of 1930s engineering, representing years of development and enormous cost. But it was designed for peacetime exercises where targets maintained predictable courses. In combat, that assumption failed. Japanese captains turned. The million-dollar computer couldn't predict that. A 15-cent wooden ruler and basic trigonometry could. This pattern repeated throughout World War II and every conflict since. Advanced systems designed under one set of assumptions encounter realities those assumptions didn't account for. The difference between success and failure often comes down to whether frontline personnel can recognize the gap between model and reality and improvise solutions. O'Kane recognized that gap. Instead of trusting the computer blindly, he observed actual target behavior, documented patterns, and developed manual adjustments. His willingness to question automated systems saved hundreds of submarines and thousands of lives. The cultural legacy is equally important. Before O'Kane, submarine doctrine emphasized trusting the TDC. Officers who questioned the computer solutions were seen as doubting Navy engineering expertise. After O'Kane proved manual adjustments worked, the culture shifted. Questioning automation became acceptable, even encouraged. Modern submarine officers are taught to verify computer solutions, check assumptions, and override automated systems when human judgment identifies problems the computer can't see. That critical thinking approach extends beyond submarines. Every naval warfare community, surface, aviation, special operations, teaches similar principles. Use technology but understand its limitations. Verify assumptions. Be ready to improvise when models fail. O'Kane's ruler method was more than a fire control technique. It was a paradigm shift in how military professionals think about the relationship between technology and human judgment. The economic calculation is straightforward. O'Kane's technique cost nothing to implement. A ruler, pencil, paper, and training time. The return on that investment was 420 additional ships sunk, 5,200 additional torpedo hits, shortened war duration, and saved American lives. Compare that to the TDC's development cost, $1.2 million in 1930s dollars, equivalent to roughly $25 million today. The TDC was valuable. It performed calculations humans couldn't do quickly enough. But it needed human oversight to account for factors it couldn't model. The lesson applies to modern military acquisition. Advanced technology is essential, but technology alone isn't sufficient. Personnel need training, authority, and cultural support to question automated systems and improvise when necessary. That combination of technology and human judgment is more effective than either alone. The submarine force learned this lesson from O'Kane and institutionalized it. Modern submarine doctrine explicitly requires officers to verify fire control solutions rather than trusting computers blindly. The personal legacy centers on O'Kane's character. He could have accepted the TDC's limitations and blamed misses on torpedo defects like other submarine commanders did. Instead, he studied the problem, developed a solution, documented results, and shared the technique with other submarines. He didn't seek credit or recognition. His technical paper on the ruler method was submitted as an unofficial patrol report supplement, not as a formal innovation proposal. O'Kane focused on solving problems, not on career advancement. That selfless approach to innovation characterized the generation that fought World War II. They saw problems, fixed them, and moved on without expecting praise. O'Kane's Medal of Honor citation mentioned fire control innovations but didn't specify the ruler method. Most Americans who learned about O'Kane after the war knew him as a submarine ace, not as the officer who made torpedo fire control work. But submarine veterans knew. They understood that O'Kane's ruler saved more lives than his 33 ship kills. The kills came from the ruler working. Other submarines used the ruler and got their own kills. The distributed impact, 420 additional ships sunk across the entire submarine force, represented O'Kane's true legacy. He changed how submarines fought, changed doctrine, changed training, changed culture, all with a wooden ruler and the willingness to question assumptions. Richard O'Kane's grave is at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 7A, Site 152. The headstone lists his rank, his Medal of Honor, and his years of service. It doesn't mention the ruler, doesn't mention fire control innovations, doesn't explain why submarine officers still visit that grave decades after his death. But if you visit Arlington on certain days, you'll see submarine dolphins, the insignia worn by qualified submariners, left at O'Kane's headstone. Sometimes there's a wooden ruler placed carefully against the stone. Nobody knows who leaves these tributes. Submarine veterans, probably. Men who learned O'Kane's method at submarine school, who used manual fire control adjustments during their careers, who understand that sometimes the simplest tools solve the hardest problems. The ruler at O'Kane's grave represents something larger than a fire control technique. It represents the principle that observation beats assumption, that documented data beats theoretical models, that 15 cents worth of maple wood guided by human judgment can outperform million-dollar computers when the computer's assumptions don't match reality. That principle remains as relevant in modern warfare as it was in 1942. Artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, and advanced computing have transformed military operations. But technology still operates on assumptions. Models still diverge from reality. Human judgment still matters. O'Kane's ruler reminds us that the most sophisticated system in the world is only as good as the humans who verify its outputs and adjust when necessary. The number of people alive today because of O'Kane's innovation is incalculable. The 180 submarines saved from loss carried roughly 14,400 crew members. Those men came home, had families, built lives. Their children and grandchildren exist because O'Kane taught submarines to aim where targets would be after they turned. The Japanese who would have died on ships that survived because submarines missed, they lived, had families. War is terrible, but shortening war reduces total casualties on all sides. O'Kane's contribution to ending the Pacific War sooner saved both American and Japanese lives. That's his ultimate legacy. Not the 33 ships he personally sank. Not the Medal of Honor. Not even the tactical innovation. His legacy is measured in lives saved, in children born, in families that existed because one submarine officer looked at a pack of targets that kept evading and decided to figure out why. He grabbed a ruler, did some math, and changed submarine warfare forever. If the story moved you, slam that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube to share this with more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're pulling forgotten innovations from dusty archives every single week. Real people. Real heroism. Real ingenuity that changed wars. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from California, Poland, India, Australia? Our community spans the globe. You're not just watching, you're part of preserving these stories. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about the officers who changed history with wooden rulers and courage. And thank you for making sure Richard O'Kane doesn't fade into silence. These heroes deserve to be remembered. You're making that happen.